Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Last week, a few former players in Northwestern's football program appeared at a press conference with the attorneys who are representing them. What are they asking for? Simply, they want a culture change and restitution on behalf of dozens of Northwestern athletes who have alleged similar behavior. The podcast opens with a sound clip from plaintiff's attorney Parker Stinar from the press conference. Why do institutions fail to protect its athletes from this abusive behavior? Has it always been this way? I'm joined by a higher education scholar, former provost, and a dean at several high-profile universities who has studied the reactions of both institutions and leaders during and after these crises. My guest is Don Heller, the retired provost and vice president of academic affairs at the University of San Francisco, and a former dean and faculty member at Michigan State and Penn State, respectively. This podcast may be difficult to hear for some of the terminology describing the alleged behaviors of former coaches and administrators, but it's an important conversation to have. I've also attached Don's article from the Chronicle of Higher Education in late October 2023.
So often it's easy for alumni, coaches, presidents, current students to overlook something like this, a toxic culture, something bad that's happened because there's a football game on Saturday. And let's celebrate, let's tailgate, let's have fun.
Hello, Don. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so glad you could join me today.
Thanks, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. You've had an amazing career working at a number of really high-profile land-grant institutions. Your last stop is at the University of San Francisco. And I'll link this article in the podcast notes for my listeners, but one of the things that is striking me about what you've written is that you've experienced much of this being an employee of these institutions. And so one of the issues that is fundamentally affecting college athletics today is this continuation of bad behavior that seems to fester inside of athletics or is somehow tied to athletics. And your article addresses the leadership challenges around managing that. So if you could talk a little bit about what prompted you to write the article, and then also what some of your thoughts about it are, that would be great.
Thanks, Karen. I think what prompted me to write the article was just following all of these issues that had been happening that I wrote about at a number of the universities that coincidentally I had worked at. And I think the last thing for me, and I think this comes through in the article, is what happened with the Mel Tucker situation at Michigan State University. And as I looked upon that, and I was just reading the news stories like everybody else, so I didn't have any kind of insight, having been a former dean at Michigan State. But just reading the news articles, it just struck me that there really was a problem at the university in terms of the leadership. And let me just say that Michigan State University, since the Nassar scandal, has just had huge turmoil in its leadership. I'm sure you've read, many of your listeners have read about the change in presidents of the university. They've now had, I think, 4 presidents in the last 5 years or so, last 6 years or so, including interims. They've had a change in athletic directors. They've had a lot of change in the board of trustees, and I should mention that the board of trustees at Michigan State is fairly unusual in that they're elected popularly across the state of Michigan, and I think that's an important piece of context for your listeners to understand. Wayne State University in Michigan and Michigan State are the 3 universities in Michigan that have these popularly elected boards. And it adds just another issue, I think, in particular in the Michigan State situation. So, reading about what was going on there is really what prompted me to do a little bit of an update to an earlier article I had written in the Chronicle about 5 years ago. And this is just about when the Larry Nassar scandal broke. That compared what had happened there with what had happened at Penn State shortly after I had left there, and the Sandusky scandal.
So there's a lot to unpack there. And just for our listeners' perspective, let's refresh their memories first about what's going on with Mel Tucker, because that's in real time right now. There's a lot of back and forth, lots of legal action going on. But then remind folks what the challenges are with the Nassar case and how that ended up, and also just a quick review of Sandusky, if you would.
Sure, there's a lot to unpack there too. Let me go in chronological order.
Sure.
The Sandusky scandal at Penn State broke in about late 2011. And coincidentally, that broke when I was leaving Penn State to join Michigan State to be dean of the College of Education. So I was sort of a lame duck professor and research center director at Penn State when, in the fall of 2011, news came out that Larry Sandusky, who had been a former football coach at Penn State, assistant coach, I should say, at Penn State, and also ran a charity focused on at-risk youth since he'd left the coaching staff at Penn State. He was arrested and charged with molesting a number of underage boys, many of whom were in the organization that he headed. He also was accused of molesting some of those boys on the facilities, the football facilities at Penn State, in the locker rooms, football locker rooms specifically. And to make a very long story short, and there's many articles, there was a documentary, there's a fictionalized biopic that was done. But what happened was that first, Joe Paterno, the longtime and well-loved coach of Penn State, football coach at Penn State, was fired shortly after the Sandusky scandal broke because he was deemed to should have known what was going on and not having control over the football program. Subsequently, the board fired the president of Penn State, Graham Spanier. And in the end, as I wrote in the article in the Chronicle, it cost the university over $300 million in legal fees and settlement costs to the victims of Jerry Sandusky. So that was the Sandusky scandal. And as I said, that occurred and broke just as I was leaving Penn State. It happened in November of 2011. I left Penn State on December 31st, and on January 2nd started as dean of the College of Education at Michigan State. And so the next step chronologically was the Larry Nassar scandal at Michigan State. Which again coincidentally broke shortly after I left there in the winter of 2016. And Larry Nassar was a doctor in the in the Michigan State health system. He also worked as a professor in the medical school, and he also worked treating athletes both at Michigan State as well as gymnasts who were sort of world-class gymnasts at a couple of facilities in the area around Michigan State's campus in the East Lansing area. He also treated members of the gymnastics team and other teams, other women's teams at Michigan State University. And he was accused by a number of victims of sexually assaulting them in the guise of performing medical examinations on them. And again, this case has well been written about. And the bottom line is Michigan State University ended up paying over $500 million in settlements with the victims of Larry Nassar, and they incurred over $60 million of legal fees associated with the case. So you see a theme here in terms of the amount of money that these kinds of cases affect universities, how much they're paying out, never mind the reputational challenges and the issues regarding the reputation of the universities. And then the last thing, as I alluded to earlier, that just broke this fall was the case of Mel Tucker, who was the football coach at Michigan State University. Very visible. A couple of years ago, Michigan State had awarded him a $10-year, $95 million contract, which I believe at the time made him the second highest paid football coach after Nick Saban at Alabama. And then it came out in a story in USA Today in September that Mel Tucker was accused by a woman named Brenda Tracy of inappropriate sexual behavior while she was on a phone call with him. And Brenda Tracy, if your listeners may recognize her name, is a woman who was, when she was younger, about 20 years ago, was allegedly sexually assaulted by a number of athletes at a university in Oregon. And she reported this, and virtually nothing was done to these athletes. But she has made a career out of working to help end sexual assault, particularly on college campuses. Sexual assault. And then she alleges sometime last year that Mel Tucker, in a phone call with her, had engaged in inappropriate sexual behavior while they were on this call. It came out publicly in USA Today story. And what came out in this story was that she had filed her complaint last December. The university had hired an outside investigator, and the investigator had submitted a report, I believe, over the summer. And the only thing evidently the university did with that report was to schedule a hearing with Mel Tucker in October, approximately 3 months after the report was in the hands of the university. And then what happened was, when the report was mentioned and came out in this article in USA Today, the university moved very quickly to suspend him from his position as coach. And then a week later, they fired him before this hearing ever happened. And, you know, the question I raise in the article is, why didn't the university move more quickly? Where was the president? Where was the athletic director? In subsequent statements after the USA Today article came out, both the AD and the president claimed that they did not see the report, that they hadn't seen the allegations, but that when they saw the article in USA Today, they did look at the information and made those decisions to suspend and then fire Mel Tucker. And the question I raised is, why were they not involved? Why didn't the university take action quicker? Why did they allow Mel Tucker to go through the pre-season practices with the team and coach the team, and we're going to allow him to coach the team up until that hearing was held in the first week in October, until the article came out and it all became public.
Certainly a lot to unpack there, but unfortunately, there's more that we know about, and you alluded to some of them in your article. Of course, we have the still ongoing investigation involving Richard Strauss, the team physician at Ohio State, who since passed away in 2005.
Yeah.
Mostly involving male athletes being alleged to have been sexually molested by the doctor. One of the more prominent people who the athletes claim should have known and should have spoken up is Congressman Jim Jordan,
Right.
Who is denied all knowledge of what happened during that period of time.
Right. And Jim Jordan was a coach on the wrestling team at the time. Right. And it was primarily wrestlers who have accused this doctor of assaulting them.
Right. So we have that. And then we continue our tour in the Big Ten, and I hate to say that, but at the University of Michigan, where we had another team physician who was also accused of sexually molesting athletes. And former head football coach Bo Schembechler was alleged to have known but not done anything about it. And we could go on and on and on. And ironically, we've seen a couple of parallel cases. One of them you mentioned, I'd like you to talk a little bit about this, the University of San Francisco, which is where your last stop has been. And also what's happened at Northwestern University involving hazing. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about those two cases as well.
Sure. The two cases, Northwestern and USF, is that
sure?
Yeah. Well, you know, the Northwestern situation, again, a very, very sad situation where late in the summer, before the season started, allegations came out that the coach at Northwestern was aware that hazing was going on. Pat Fitzgerald was the coach's name. Allegations came out that students on the football team, or student athletes, were being hazed. And the coaching staff was allegedly aware of what was going on, including Pat Fitzgerald, the head coach, and ignored it or didn't deal with it on a timely basis. And at the end of the day, the university made the decision to fire him for cause and cancel his contract. And the situation at University of San Francisco, and I point this out in the article, the University of San Francisco is very different from all the other cases I referenced in my article. Um, University of San Francisco is not a big time sports school. It is Division I, but it doesn't have a football team. Interestingly enough, part of the reasons it doesn't have the football team is that it did. And a number of years ago, there was a scandal regarding the team. And the president at the time made the decision to just shut down the football program. But it's Division I, but it plays and it's most well known for two sports, basketball and men's soccer. It plays in a mid-major conference, the West Coast Conference, so certainly doesn't have anywhere near the visibility these Big Ten schools or any of the other Power Five schools have had. And one of the things I talk about in the article, just very briefly, is that the sports plays a very minor role on campus. You'll go to a men's basketball team and on the good days when they may sell out their gym, when Gonzaga comes in, for example, for a game, they'll have about 3,500 or 4,000 people at a game. So it's a very different kind of environment. There's not a lot of enthusiasm over sports. Few of the students go to any of the sporting events. Most of the people at the basketball games are alums and other basketball fans. So it's a very different kind of environment than is any one of these Big Ten schools that I talked about earlier. And yet, in the article, I point out that even though it's not a big sports school, it has had scandals around sports. There were three in particular that I talked about. There was a head baseball coach and also an assistant baseball coach who were fired for creating, and I'm quoting now from a report the university issued, an intolerable sexualized environment. Where there were sex acts that were not going on at the practices or in the locker room, but sort of joking about sex and the coaches participating in allowing those things to go on. Just an inappropriate environment, particularly in the 21st century when we're so aware of what's appropriate behavior and what's inappropriate behavior, even in a locker room, in a men's sports locker room. That was one thing that went on. There was a head women's basketball coach. There is the head women's basketball coach who is still the coach today, who was sued by two of her former players for inflicting emotional distress on them in practices and during games. This actually went to trial. And one of the two players was awarded $750,000 by a jury here in San Francisco, who agreed that what the coach did was to inflict emotional distress on this player. And again, beyond what the jury said, that's just inappropriate behavior for a coach. And yeah. To be honest, and frankly, and in defense of the university, they've said that they're going to appeal this jury verdict and this award. But again, I have to raise the question of why is she still employed as a coach there when you've got a jury who sided with this player? And then the third thing that happened a couple of years ago was that the men's soccer program had a history of harboring players who engaged in sexual misconduct for a number of years. And a report that was commissioned by the university of outside reviewers concluded that, in fact, there were 11 players who were accused of engaging in sexual misconduct over a number of years. So again, the point here is you've got a school that's very different from any of these, Big Ten, big football or big basketball schools. And yet even there, these things can go on and create environments for the players that are just inappropriate and the kinds of environments that any parent who sends their child off to college would not want to see them having to experience.
It's heavy stuff. And you make an excellent point that this could happen at any campus, in any athletics team, if the right environment is there. And I think that's what I'd like to spend the rest of the time thinking and talking about, because you're a very well-known higher ed scholar. You've held increasingly responsible positions, including the Provost office at University of San Francisco. So you're one of the senior leaders we talk about that's on campus as you've moved through it. What do you think is going wrong in the culture? What should presidents not do? And what should presidents be doing to try to avoid having this happen on their campus?
Well, I think the first step, Karen, is that it is, as you point out, presidents have a role in creating culture. It's not the only role. I mean, culture is something that happens throughout the campus, and there are many people, faculty, students, and staff who help create a culture on the campus. But there's no question that the CEO, the president, or the chancellor has a critical role in that culture and helping to shape that culture. And probably, I think the most important thing that a president can do is to signal a zero tolerance policy for this kind of behavior. And one of the things I point out in the article is that, I think too often on college campuses, we get caught up in issues of due process and worrying about, if we move too quickly on an employee when allegations first surface, that they may sue us over it. And the point I make in the article is that the examples I gave of Larry Nassar at Michigan State, Jerry Sandusky at Penn State, that, if in fact the universities had moved more quickly when allegations were first raised, then a lot of people would have been saved, would not have been assaulted. If the universities had acted more quickly, the cost to the universities, both in terms of money and reputation, would have been very different. And the risk they would have run was, well, if I decide to suspend this employee when the allegations first surfaced, am I going to get sued over this?
Mhm.
And the argument I make is, better to have one employee suing you over, an inappropriate or too quickly suspending them or firing them, than having, scores or even hundreds of students and others being assaulted and attacked. And it coming out years and years later that, in fact, the university could have taken steps more quickly. So I think the presidents have to signal that there will be a zero tolerance policy towards this, that they have to act quickly when allegations come forward. And I'm not saying that any single time an allegation is made that somebody should be fired or suspended, but I think that presidents need to be able and be willing to be able to act a little bit more quickly, a little bit more forcefully, and not just rely on the existing processes in place, not just push it down into the bureaucracy to deal with it, but particularly when you've got a very visible part of the university, the football program, the basketball program, a football coach. They need to deal with this and deal with this more quickly.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because one of the questions that came up in my mind as you were speaking was, are we treating coaches with larger contracts, higher profile, or let's say employees differently because we're afraid of the media blowback? Is that part of what's going on here?
That may be part of it. As I look and I read and hear about these scandals and I think about them, and I often will say to myself, okay, let's pretend that this was not a football coach, or let's pretend that this was somebody who was not affiliated with the football program or the wrestling program, and it was an employee in another part of the university. How would things have played out differently? And every time I ask myself that, the answer I give myself is it would have been very different, and that things probably would have moved more quickly to address the allegations, to investigate them more quickly, without the fear that it's going to tarnish such a visible part of the university. And there's no question, I think, that presidents and boards and leadership of universities are aware of this, and they have to be aware of the reputational risk if something comes out about one of, if not the most visible part of the university. But having said that, we've learned now that if you don't deal with these issues early on when the allegations first surface, it blows up into a huge and expensive and painful scandal that affects dozens and dozens and dozens of people.
Do you think it as staying with the media theme for a second, do you think it is the fact that we have so many around the country covering college sports, beat writers, local beat writers, bloggers, podcasters, who are digging for stories, digging for angles when it comes to sports, but maybe not when it comes to being dean of the chemistry department or, that
Right.
type of thing? Is it that part of it as well?
I think that's part of it. There's, obviously a lot of scrutiny over college sports these days. And, we've always had beat writers covering the Penn State football team or the Michigan football team or the Michigan State basketball team or whatever. But you're right. I think there are much more attention today between bloggers and different online media outlets that cover college sports. So it does receive a lot more attention, and you do have people digging around to things and finding things out that perhaps 20 years ago would have remained buried and not seen the light of day the way they do today.
And you just mentioned the fact that leaders need to be more proactive, need to jump into the fray sooner to sort of calm down. But as you well know, so many people rise to the presidency, maybe not having ever dealt with something like this. And so what can we do to better prepare them for situations that may come up? And just because we don't hear about a Division II or Division III program doesn't mean that same kind of behavior isn't happening on those campuses. It just may not get the coverage, the exposure. So thinking proactively, what kinds of training might future presidents need to have to be prepared for this?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about these kinds of things happening in Division II and Division III programs as well. They don't get this, as you point out, they don't get the same kind of attention that the big Division I programs do. But you read stories about hazing that goes on, and even Division III programs and things like that. It's a good question about the training, and you're right. I think most college presidents, almost all college presidents, get to this position without having to deal with this kind of scandal, this kind of major scandal. So for most of them, it's a lot of on-the-job learning. There are things, there are programs out there that serve to educate presidents who are new to being a president. My alma mater, the Harvard Graduate School of Education, runs a very good, I think it's about a 2-week program in the summers for new college presidents, where they, and most college presidents have had significant leadership experience. Most have been provosts before, they've been deans. Sometimes they come in with experience outside of academe. But being a college president, rising to that level of being the CEO, the person responsible for the entire campus, is definitely a different set of skills. And, so programs like Harvard's and others that focus on new college presidents, I think they try to, give them a little bit of background about dealing with these kinds of issues when they rise on campus. But I think the reality, Karen, is that no kind of education and training can really prepare a president for this. And what presidents have to do is they have to rely on their staff, they have to rely on their legal counsels, they have to rely on their boards to help them through and work through these kinds of issues. The problem, of course, is that in most cases, none of these other people have had experience with this as well. So they're all new to it, and they're all struggling to figure out what's the right thing to do. And I think that as these happen more and more, and they have been happening more and more, we have sort of case studies of what have happened. I think when the Sandusky scandal happened at Penn State, it was really the first time that a major scandal of that size and that visibility, one that brought down Joe Paterno, arguably one of the most visible football coaches in the country. That's really the first time something at that scale had really happened. But now we've got a half dozen of these, so there are lessons we can learn from these. Let me also say that, and I point this out in my article, that structure matters as well. I think part of the issues at the University of San Francisco is that it's very unusual in that the athletics program does not report to the president. It didn't report to me as the provost. It reported to the chief financial officer. And the chief financial officer, while he's very good at his job, is not somebody who has any responsibility for students and student development, any of the processes around Title IX, anything like that. And I had raised this issue with the president on a number of occasions, and my concerns about that as smaller things had happened within athletics. But I couldn't get frankly, couldn't get any progress on that. And he made the decision to keep the athletic program under the chief financial officer. And I can't state for sure that if it had been moved under the president, if it had been moved under me as provost, that things would have been different. But I have to believe that somebody like the president or provost at a university who has responsibility for students. So for example, when I was provost, I had not just the academic colleges, but student affairs reported to me, which means Title IX reported to me. And I just have to believe that, having either the president or the provost who has that responsibility for students overseeing athletics would be better oversight than somebody like a chief financial officer.
Mhm.
So that's why I point out in the article, the structure matters as well.
One thing that's been kind of perking around in my head about this too is when, even if the athletic director doesn't report to the president, on many campuses, he or she still has regular meetings with the president just to kind of keep
Yes.
him informed, right?
Yeah.
But it might be a really good idea, in my thoughts, that the president let the athletic director to know, as soon as you know something, I want you to get to me. I don't want you to have to manage it or deal with it. And also, Mr. or Ms. AD, what are you doing in terms of creating that pipeline where information can flow from some of the lower level staffers who might be around some of this behavior to feel comfortable enough to report it up the chain? Because sometimes there's a real power differential there. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Sure. I'm besides my professional roles at these universities, I've also been a board member at DePaul University for 10 years now. And DePaul, again, is Division I. Athletics, does not have a football team, but is in a major basketball conference, the Big East Conference. Some would argue this one of, if not the strongest basketball conference in the country. And I'm on the athletics committee at DePaul. And we spend a lot of time talking about these issues of how do you set up an environment? How do you create, to use the word you used before, a culture within the athletics program that people feel comfortable, that they feel free to raise any issues, any concerns they have without fear of retribution, without fear of it affecting their job if they're an employee, or they're standing as a student athlete if they are on a team. How do you create that culture, and how do you do that? And the answer that we've come up with, which I think is the answer for any institution, is first of all education, educating employees and the student athletes about what is appropriate and what's not appropriate in our environment. I think at DePaul we have one important thing going for the university, and that it is a Catholic school, so that ethics and morals are something that is part of the curriculum, that students have to take courses in this. And I think it's an important part of the culture of the university that in many instances they fall back on, a culture that says there are rights and there are wrongs. Yes, there are gray areas. So I think creating that kind of culture is important, and educating student athletes and staff within the athletics program about that. Now, I said that about DePaul being a Catholic school, and of course the University of San Francisco is a Catholic school as well. It's a Jesuit school. And I think I would argue that there's certainly a lot of the same characteristics that DePaul has, of there being, a strong foundation of ethics and morals on campus, and yet even with that, they still have these issues within the athletics program.
That's a lot. That's a lot to think about, but I'm really glad to hear that DePaul is first having an athletics committee on the board, because that's not exactly the most common thing in the world. But then that you get down into, how do we align the mission and culture of the institution with the mission and culture of athletics? I think that's a really powerful idea. Can you give my listeners maybe one or two other ideas of how they could approach this to their leadership team or to their board if they wanted to do something like this?
Yeah, and you mentioned this, Karen, even if the athletics director doesn't report directly to the president, and I think in most Division I institutions, certainly in the Power Five and the Big East, I think almost all athletic directors report directly to the president. When I was researching the article I wrote and talking about USF having athletics reporting to the CFO, I did a quick look at the other members of the West Coast Conference. There's no other university within the West Coast Conference that has athletics reporting to a chief financial officer. And I think every one of the others, with the exception of one university, the AD reports directly to the president. Again, even though this is a mid-major conference, and most of the schools do not have football. So I think the athletic director, having a good relationship with the president, having regular face-to-face contact with the president, and being willing and able and feeling comfortable to bring things to the president's attention, even if they're just starting to bubble up, and say, hey, look, I just want to make you aware of this. I've heard a few things, we're investigating, we're trying to gather more information. just making the president aware of that so that the president can say, hey, let's talk about this a little bit more. Do we need to bring in X? Do we need to bring in Y? Is it too early? Those kinds of questions. And just having another person outside of athletics who can, ask those kinds of questions, I think is important. So the relationship between an AD and a president is critical.
Yeah.
The AD has to be able to feel like they can raise those issues without fear of retribution from the